Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah? This is on. Okay. Okay, it's a pleasure to be here, and what I want to talk about today is some of my research that deals with climate change skepticism or denial. I think there's actually a distinction between skepticism and denial, and we can talk about that later if necessary. For now, I want to talk about denial as being defined as the rejection, active rejection of scientific evidence, which I think, in light of public opinion, is a fairly important topic. Now, just very briefly to set the stage, these are data from America by Lazarevitz et al. And colleagues. They repeatedly sample the American population, and as you know, perhaps they classify American public opinion into 6 categories, 2 of whom, known as doubtful or dismissives, are the people who are least concerned about climate change. They have the least belief in climate change and are not motivated to do anything about it. Now, there's something interesting here, and that is that the number of those people is actually fairly small. They amount to about 20% of the American population. By the time you put in the disengaged, you're still only talking about roughly 30%. The other 70% being, at least in principle, willing to do something about the problem. Now, there is something very interesting, however, about the small segment of people who are dismissives or in denial, and I want to explain that with this graph here, which is unfortunately fairly complicated, but let me walk you through it. It's from an Australian survey, but I think the same probably holds true in my experience around the world. Now, what you can see here are the dashed horizontal lines. They reflect the actual prevalence of an opinion in the population. So, in this large-scale survey, about 50% of the people correctly identified climate change as happening and as being caused by humans. There was a further 40% who acknowledged climate change and, however, put it down to natural causes. There are a few who don't know. And finally, over here, there are the people, about 5%. This dashed line here gives you the actual prevalence in the population. About 5% who deny that climate change is happening at all. That's a very small number. 5% of Australians, roughly, compared to 50% who get it completely right, another 40% who at least acknowledge it's happening but think it is natural. Now, those are the actual opinions in society. What is more interesting about this graph are the various bars shown here, which is the perception of the prevalence of that opinion held by the people who have that opinion. So I said it's a complicated graph, pardon me for that, but it basically means that those people who think that humans cause the climate, who actually make up 50% of the population, they think that it is shared, that opinion, by only 40%. They underestimate how many people share their opinion. And the same over here, those who think climate change is happening, they think only 30% of the people are sharing their opinion. And now, over here, we have this incredible difference where the 8% or 5% think that their opinion is shared by nearly half the population. Now that is crucial because it turns out that this discrepancy between actual opinion and what people think their opinion is worth, so to speak, in society, the greater that discrepancy, the more resilient people are to change. And that is what motivated cognition is all about. These people will not change their opinion. And they're therefore a very difficult target group. I think they are, in fact, the least promising of all target groups. And just to give you a brief anecdote of what it might be like to engage with people like that, this is an excerpt from an email I got recently where somebody said, oh, how about we get to know each other? We're on different sides of this issue, but let's just have a nice chat. And I replied saying, sure, by the way, if you're interested, I'm giving him some papers, sending him some PDFs. He can't get beyond the abstract without paying. And so I send him the paper. A day later, he tells me, oh dear, it is clear to me that you have not adhered to the proper ethics of academia and science. I have no idea why. That just popped out of the blue after we had this exchange. The next day or thereabouts, this appears on that person's blog. I think Lewandowsky is in the pay of big oil, and he's a part of a conspiracy to make skeptics fearful of suggesting there is a conspiracy, so that we dare not mention that this is a real conspiracy to make us think there's a... Whoa. Whoa, okay. You can Google it. That's out there. You can Google it. You'll find it. I wouldn't be surprised if they're running Google alerts on me, and they may well show up in the Twitter stream before this talk is over. That makes it hard, and I would suggest that therefore we need to communicate differently, and not with those people, but perhaps other target audiences. But we still need to understand where these talking points come from. What supplies, how does this denial, or whatever you want to call it, how does that work? Now, what's this? Can somebody tell me who that is? Mona Lisa. Raise your hand if you think it's the Mona Lisa. Thank you. Is this the Mona Lisa? Raise your hand if you think it is. Thank you. Except, no, if you're a contrarian, you will say this is Mr. Bean. There he is. That is how climate contrarians operate, and I think it is important to understand that. Let me show you some as yet unpublished data where I'm addressing this issue. This is a verbatim quote from the Heartland Institute, which is telling us that Arctic ice has, there's nothing to worry about. There was more in 2009 than 1989. Now, that's a bit puzzling because the data look like this. That's 1989, that's 2009. Huh? Where is the return to 1989? Well, if you have another look at the statement, it's very carefully crafted. They say April 2009. Let's have a look on a monthly basis. Right, here we go. 2009 is the red dots, the blue line is 1989, and indeed, in April, for 1 month, there was more ice in 2009 than 1989. Now, it's a bit hard to find this by accident. I would claim that you actually have to look for this before you can make that point. Now, I ran a study using this particular example and a bunch of others, in a blind test with expert economists where I presented the statement and the data, but everything was translated into economic data. So all the emotion and the politics was taken out. The experts didn't know it was about climate, and I asked them whether the statement is misleading. I asked them a whole bunch of questions. This is just one of them. And as you can see in the Heartland case, and most of the others, virtually all the others, the experts agreed, or even almost strongly agreed, that the statement is misleading. So we can show that some of the production side of denial consists of misleading the public. Just in case you didn't know this ahead of time, we now have a blind empirical test of that proposition. And I think that's important to understand. And there's a lot more evidence to suggest that, of course, that this is orchestrated and financed and all that, which I don't have time to talk about. But it still leaves us with a puzzle. And that is the other side of what I call denial. There's a supply side, and then there is a demand side. The demand side are the consumers. Who would consume the Heartland Institute? Who would go there rather than to the IPCC? What are the factors driving the acceptance of contrarian messages? Well, Irene has already hinted at many of these factors, so have others earlier. I will briefly walk you through a few of them before hopefully having time to talk about potential solutions. Now, the most important predictor in all the work is worldview or ideology. People's basic beliefs about how the world should be structured, their personal identity. Now, you can look at this in a lot of different ways. It's a nuanced concept. Here I'm going to focus on people's view of the free market. Why? Well, because it turns out that my data show that that is a very crucial predictor. And just to sort of encapsulate this into another anecdote or brief citations, on the one hand, we have this worldview, which I think most of us are familiar with, that the scientists are telling us the scientific conclusions have been examined so closely that they're considered as a settled fact, and global warming is one of those settled facts. That's on the one side of the ledger. This is what we would all like people to believe so that we can solve the problem we have. The other worldview is shown here. I think it's neatly encapsulated in the title of a book, The Greatest Hoax, How the Global Warming Conspiracy Threatens Your Future. Now, this is a US senator from Oklahoma. I'm embarrassed to say, I used to live in Oklahoma. He's a sitting US senator, he's very influential, and he wrote this book, and, I don't think he was kidding when he wrote that. I don't think he was just trying to sell it. I think he actually meant that. Well, it's hard to know, but I'm guessing he meant that on the basis of interactions I've had, not with him, but others like him. So, those are the two worldviews that we have, the two polarized opinions about climate change. What tells us which of those two opinions or worldviews people will hold? Well, the answer is, in a nutshell, it is the extent to which people endorse free market economics. Now, what I'm showing you here is a correlation of minus 0.87. The reason I show you that number is because those are the number that show up in my data when I give people 4 or 5 questions about the free market and 4 or 5 questions about the climate. The more they endorse the free market, the more they say unregulated free markets are the only way to run society, the more they say that, the less likely they're to accept the findings from climate science. That is the strength of the correlation, just visually. Looking at a number is one thing, but seeing how strong that is, I think, is an important way to hammer home the point. 4 questions about the free market tell me that much about people's attitudes towards the laws of physics, which at first glance, of course, have nothing to do with the free market. Now, this was mentioned earlier. Let me show you some data here to back that up. I think it was Rasmus who said that possibly that education is not the solution. On the contrary, education makes things worse, in a sense, because this has been replicated many times. This is from Gallup poll, that as Republicans have more education, their acceptance of climate science declines to 19% if they have a college degree. That's less than Republicans who don't go to college. The reverse is true for Democrats. There's a bifurcation with education. Educating people can have tragic effects, so it appears. Here's another data set. A poll by Hamilton shows exactly the same way. This is concern with global warming. Democrats go up, Republicans go down as a function of their self-reported degree of knowledge. Republicans who are extremely well informed about global warming don't see it as a threat at all. Those who are not very well informed are willing to accept it as a threat, and there aren't any who are not at all informed about climate change. Now, for Democrats, it goes the other way around. So again, we have this extreme polarization. More information, more education drives people apart. And that's a serious problem. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is that there's more than free market ideology in play. And this is something that if 5 years ago somebody had said I would do research on this, I would have just laughed at them because I was not at all interested in conspiratorial thinking. Believe me, I am not interested in it, actually. But I do research on it by coincidence because it turns out that wherever you look, when people reject well-established scientific findings, one of the ways in which they do that is by postulating a conspiracy among the scientists. Look here, this is the tobacco industry saying that medical research is a vertically integrated, highly concentrated, oligopolistic cartel, whatever that is, that manufactures alleged evidence. The alleged evidence is the link between, smoking and lung cancer, right? May have heard of that. That's what they call alleged evidence. And here we have Senator James Inhofe again saying, hey, it's all a hoax. Now, that is sadly below the surface of pretty much any strongly believing contrarian out there. And it's totally understandable because if virtually all the scientists agree that the evidence is pointing one way, but your worldviews don't permit you to accept that, then what are you going to do? Well, you're going to say, oh, they're just, they're making it up. They just want grant money. These greedy climate scientists, exactly. You just want more grant money. Gosh, I don't get anything out of my grant money. I just hire somebody to do work for me. It doesn't benefit me at all, but somehow that, of course, is lost. So I did some research on this simply to enshrine my status as one of the most hated people on the internet. And I asked people in a representative survey of 1,000 Americans to tell me something about various different sciences, not just climate science. And I looked at free market ideology and also conspiratorial thinking. I asked people something about the world government and whether MI6 killed Princess Diana, that type of thing. Believe it or not, some people are quite forthcoming in their opinion. They'll say, oh, sure, yeah. Oh, plenty of time. And guess what? In these data, 2 studies I've run, lots of other studies other people have done, and wherever you look, not surprisingly, conspiratorial thinking predicts the rejection of scientific propositions to varying extents. It's actually a much stronger correlation for vaccinations than it is for climate change, for example. For climate change, it's rather small. For vaccinations, it's rather large. There's a large number of people out there who think that, vaccinations are somehow the result of greedy doctors trying to save lives. And so these correlations are real, and I think we have to take them into account. Because, as pretty much everybody knows, talking to conspiracy theorists is not something that is usually successful, at least not in the short run. And I showed you earlier that I tried. So that gives you a thumbnail sketch of why people reject findings from climate science. But that's sort of all bad news, so I don't want to stop there. I now want to go on, and I have time to talk about the factors that facilitate acceptance. Given all this, what can we do? How do we deal with something that is this strong? How do we overcome the ideological barriers and everything we've heard about? And all the speakers this morning have already made some very interesting comments about how to achieve this. Now, fortunately, there's a little bit left for me to talk about because there are some additional things I can say now that don't overlap with stuff you've already heard. Now, it's very clear to me that the public is very unlikely to perceive the urgency of the solution and, the urgency of the problem and the effort that's required for a solution. But I don't think it follows from that the public won't support solutions. I think that inference is not necessarily warranted. Because we know that from a number of papers, this is one by Ding et al., that people are in support of policies to address the climate problem, provided they understand that the scientists are in agreement. And then there are some moderating key beliefs, which in themselves are interesting, but I won't have time to get into that. But there is a key driver here, and that is the perceived scientific agreement. And the problem that we're facing is not just that people don't understand the science, and it's not just ideology, it's also that people are unaware of the strength of the scientific consensus. The fact that somewhere upward of 90% of the literature and of the scientists and scientific academies, that they all agree on the problem. That fact, which is very obvious to us, is lost on the public. These are data from a representative survey done in America, as yet unpublished. It was done by one of my PhD students, John Cook, who's running Skeptical Science. And what he's showing here is the perceived consensus among scientists. And you will find that even for the people who should be naturally inclined to believe the science, namely those who are not free market fundamentalists, the perceived consensus is only around 70%. For those who are predisposed to oppose the science because of their free market attitudes, that number is even less. I mean, that's ridiculous. They think that 1 in 3 of the scientists agrees on climate change. The other 2 in 3 don't. Well, I mean, the reality is it's a 97% consensus. So if this perception is important, and if it underlies people's policy views, can we do something about this? Well, the answer is yes, a little bit, at least. This is what you're looking at now, is actually a stimulus from one of my experiments. I've done a number of experiments like that. In this particular variant, my research assistant would walk up to pedestrians at random in an Australian city, would wave this thing in their face, say, look here, did you know this? And then ask them to indicate their climate beliefs. And of course, in a control condition, we did no such thing. We just asked them about their belief. Here are the data. What you can see here is that we get the usual effect in the control condition, whereby increased support for free markets is associated with a decline in acceptance of climate science. But if you provide that consensus information, there is a boost in belief. People say, oh, really? Gee, I better take it seriously then. And a surprising fact is, initially this was extremely surprising, that this boost was greatest for the people who were actually predisposed to be skeptical because of their personal worldviews. So telling people about the consensus makes some difference. Now, this has been fairly controversial, I think, that result. Some people found it counterintuitive, so as did I, and thought it couldn't possibly replicate, as did I. I was very worried about that. But as it happens, it has been replicated several times. In Australia, as well as in America. It doesn't work quite as well in America because amongst the they happen to be on the right on this graph. So far right, meaning far right on the graph, that just means strong endorsement of free markets. There can be a slight backfire effect, but overall this works, and other people have done it. It isn't just me who's done that. So that works. The other thing that works, this is a paper that's forthcoming in +1, is to reframe the loss. People talked about the loss before, that, gee, I have to pay more taxes. My God, I'm not going to do that, right? That's a loss frame. And here's a wonderful cite. It's a little long, I apologize for that, but this is from the opposition leader at the time in Australia, who is now Prime Minister of Australia. He has recently threatened to take his shirt off when he's confronting Vladimir Putin at the G20. He is a colorful, he's Australian, what can I say? Colorful man. And this is what he said in response to, or to attack the carbon tax that the previous government put in. And he's talking about a loss. Gross national income per person, $5,000 lower in 2050. The equivalent of a 40, cumulative, $1 trillion. Whoa, okay. Real wages are projected to be almost 6% lower. That's lower in 2050. Equivalent of a 4,000. Oh my God, by the time you're through, who would want a carbon tax? This is what I call a very successful fear campaign. And it was very successful. It got him elected. Is it true? Well, sort of, kind of, yes. It is true that it costs money to do something about climate change. And on the left here, we're showing a graph that shows the cost to national income per person as a function of emission cuts. But you know, it's not the whole story, because on the right, I'm showing you the same data in a different way, namely as a foregone gain. What this is showing is national income. These are real data, by the way, Australian Treasury data. Current Australian average national income per person, the red line. In 2020, if we do nothing, it goes up to here. If we cut emissions, guess what? Still goes up, just not quite as much. So it's a foregone gain. These are the same numbers, a foregone gain versus a loss. Tony Abbott focused on this. In fact, it wasn't just Tony Abbott. We did a media analysis that I'll show you in a moment, and the media were also totally hooked into this loss frame. But when it is framed as a foregone gain, these are data from a representative Australian sample. We ask people how much do they want to cut emissions, with graphs of the type I just showed you that go up and down as people adjust their preferred policy option. So we get people to put their money, hypothetically, where their opinion is. And what we find is that if we express things as a foregone gain, we get far greater policy support, the blue bars, as opposed to when it is framed in a loss. So people are willing to spend money if they recognize it as a foregone gain, not a loss. And out of 900 Australian news articles we looked at most one used a foregone gain framing. Everybody else talked about the loss, the cost to income, etc. So, to wrap up, these are the toolbox that I can point to. I mentioned this one, underscoring the scientific consensus. I mentioned the foregone gains. There are others. Even providing factual information, according to my granny, does make a difference, contrary to some of the concerns we heard earlier. I'm very surprised by that myself. And framing climate change as a health issue and emphasizing the co-benefits, how we're all better off to live longer, is a successful strategy. So is this enough? That's my final question. My answer, suggestive, tentative answer is no. What really matters is politics. Politicians who take on big tasks and show leadership, even if it means taking on corporations. But should we ever have those leaders, then certainly we have the tools available to help them communicate with the public to make a change. I'll stop there. Thank you.